Frank Shamrock wasn't just a fighter, he was the prototype, the first complete mixed martial artist. Before Georges St-Pierre was called the best, before Jon Jones dominated headlines, there was Frank. He blended striking, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and charisma at a time when others were one-dimensional. But after helping shape what modern MMA became, Frank vanished from the UFC spotlight. Not because he declined, but because he said the wrong thing to the wrong people. This is the story of how Frank Shamrock built the UFC's blueprint and then got erased from history. And at the very end of it all, there's a darker reality few fans know about, one that shows how brutal the fight world can really be. Before the UFC turned into billion-dollar television, before the cage-side suits and Reebok deals, it was a wild arena where style clashed with style. There were boxers, wrestlers, karate guys, and rarely did anyone dare to mix them all. Then came Frank Shamrock, a wiry, intense fighter who didn't fit into any single mold. He wasn't just a striker, he wasn't just a grappler, he was the first real mixed martial artist, and that alone made him a threat to everyone who came before. Frank was adopted by Bob Shamrock, the same man who raised Ken Shamrock. But while Ken embodied brute force and aggression, Frank was a tactician, a thinker. He studied disciplines like catch wrestling, sambo, kickboxing, and even yoga. Yes, yoga. At a time when MMA was still mocked as barroom brawling, Frank was thinking about breath control, body mechanics, and how to fight smarter, not just harder. He debuted in Pancrase and early UFC offshoots with a style that confused and overwhelmed opponents. When the UFC created the light heavyweight division in 1997, Frank stepped in and immediately made history. At UFC 16, he knocked out Igor Zinoviev in just 22 seconds. The punch wasn't flashy, it was surgical. Zinoviev went down hard, landed awkwardly, and never fought again. That moment wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Frank wasn't here to be flashy, he was here to end you. But his most legendary fight came at UFC 22 against Tito Ortiz, the cocky powerhouse who seemed destined to dominate. Ortiz was younger, bigger, and had the UFC's promotional machine behind him. In the first rounds, he overwhelmed Frank, took him down, smashed him with elbows. But Frank didn't panic. He absorbed, observed, and waited. By round 4, Tito was exhausted. Frank exploded. A flurry of punches, a brutal ground-and-pound assault, and it was over. It wasn't just a comeback. It was proof that intelligence could defeat size and hype. Frank Shamrock retired from the UFC right after that fight, while still the champion. No defeat, no decline, just gone. And fans were left wondering why one of the greatest fighters alive would walk away at the top of his game. What the public didn't see was the storm brewing behind the curtains. After UFC 22, Frank was champion, but also frustrated. He had been underpaid, undervalued, and overlooked. He wasn't asking for celebrity perks. He was asking for basic respect. And when he looked at the new leadership stepping in, namely Dana White, he saw red flag. Frank wanted fighters to be treated like professionals. He believed in union, better health care, and long-term planning. Dana White, still a brash newcomer at the time, saw Frank as a problem, a know-it-all, a threat to control. Frank asked for more creative say. Dana said no. Frank wanted to shape how the sport evolved. Dana wanted someone who played by the rules. Their conflict wasn't about ego, it was about vision. Frank saw MMA as an art form that should grow responsibly. Dana saw it as a business that needed to explode. The clash was inevitable, and so Frank walked away. He didn't wait for a forced retirement. He didn't beg for fights. He gave up his UFC title and disappeared from the organization. No Hall of Fame induction, no tribute, just a sudden silence from the very company he helped elevate. Dana White never spoke kindly of Frank again. In fact, over the next 2 decades, Frank's name was rarely, if ever, uttered in official UFC broadcasts. New fans wouldn't even know he existed. Even when classic fights were replayed, Frank's epic win over Tito Ortiz was quietly buried in the archives. It was as if someone hit delete on his legacy. But it wasn't just silence that stung. It was the replacement. Dana started hyping new champions, new stars, all using the blueprint Frank built. Cross-training became the standard. Strategy became the weapon. The world was finally catching up to Frank Shamrock. just without Frank Shamrock in the picture. And while that chapter was closing, Frank wasn't finished yet. He had one more plan: to build something of his own. Frank didn't fade into obscurity, not right away. After exiting the UFC, he went global. Japan welcomed him back with open arms. He returned to Pancrase, trained elite fighters, and began building his image internationally. But back in the US, something was brewing. MMA was heating up again, and Frank saw an opening. He would build his own empire. He became a central figure in Strikeforce, one of the only real competitors to the UFC during the mid-2000s. Frank wasn't just fighting, he was promoting, coaching, and hosting. He was shaping cards, finding talent, teaching up-and-coming stars how to fight like thinkers, not just sluggers. He brought legitimacy to the promotion. When Strikeforce put Frank in the main event, people watched. He had a natural charisma that didn't rely on trash talk or theatric. It was intelligent. People wanted to learn how he saw the fight. Every pre-fight breakdown felt like a masterclass. For a moment, it looked like the UFC might finally have a rival. Frank even helped sign high-profile fighters, including Cung Le, Josh Thompson, and Nick Diaz. The cards were stacked, the crowds were growing, and the sport had never felt more alive. But behind the scenes, a familiar shadow returned. The UFC, flush with cash and backed by the Fertitta brothers, began absorbing competitors. WEC, Pride, and finally, Strikeforce. Zuffa bought them all, and when they did, history started getting rewritten. Frank's influence faded, his Strikeforce contributions minimized. Once again, his name was lost in the merge. Fighters he coached were given new narratives. His commentary clips were trimmed. His fights, now under UFC ownership, were pushed down in the algorithm. It was happening all over again, only this time, it wasn't a choice. Frank Shamrock had tried to build something away from the system, but the system swallowed it whole. And instead of being recognized as the godfather of modern MMA, he became a ghost. And as the spotlight dimmed again, his next battle wasn't with another fighter, but with his own past. Frank's battle wasn't just with promoters, it was with blood. The Shamrock name had always meant violence, discipline, and pride. But behind closed doors, it meant something darker: resentment, betrayal, and silence. Ken and Frank were raised as brothers under Bob Shamrock's group home system, but they were never the same. Ken was the hammer, Frank was the scalpel, and eventually they turned those tools on each other. Their falling out didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers. As Frank rose through the UFC, Ken was already established as a superstar. But Frank didn't get a helping hand. He got opposition. According to Frank, Ken treated him more like competition than family. He accused Ken of sabotaging his early career, of trying to control his contracts, of demanding loyalty but not giving it in return. Publicly, the tension boiled over in interviews. Frank accused Ken of being jealous and manipulative. Ken fired back, calling Frank selfish and ungrateful. Ken claimed Frank betrayed their family and abandoned the Lion's Den, the legendary training camp they had once built together. What made it worse was that Bob Shamrock, the man who raised them both, passed away in 2010. The two brothers didn't reconcile at the funeral. Frank openly admitted he didn't feel welcome there. The family feud had gone too far. Too many things were said. Too many scars were never addressed. Frank later revealed he left Bob's ashes in the closet for over a year because he couldn't bring himself to face the broken family dynamic. The UFC never helped mend things. When Ken was inducted into the Hall of Fame, Frank was nowhere to be seen. Not because he wasn't invited, but because he refused. He said he couldn't stand by and applaud an industry that erased his name while elevating others who, in his words, just played the game. The fans were left confused. Two brothers who once stood atop the fighting world, now taking shots at each other across podcasts and press. And beneath the surface, something deeper was breaking: the legacy of the Shamrock name. What should have been a shared triumph turned into a silent war, and Frank, the architect of modern MMA, was now isolated, not just from the UFC, but from his own family history. The Shamrocks had become symbols of MMA's early brutality, but in the end, it wasn't fists that caused the deepest damage. It was silence, and Frank's silence would soon grow louder than ever. For a brief moment, Frank Shamrock was on the verge of a mainstream comeback. In 2009, He was given the kind of opportunity most fighters only dream about, a headlining spot on CBS primetime. This wasn't cable, this wasn't pay-per-view, this was American network television, a chance to show the world that MMA wasn't just brawling in cages, it was strategy, discipline, and story. Frank was supposed to be the ambassador. The fight was against Nick Diaz, a tough, unrelenting scrapper known for his chin, volume, and attitude. Frank knew what he was walking into. He wasn't in his prime anymore. He was 36, slightly slower, slightly older. But this was his stage, his return, his message to the world. It didn't go as planned. From the opening bell, Diaz picked Frank apart. He peppered him with jabs, walked him down, and outpaced him in every exchange. Frank, known for his footwork and timing, looked out of sync, and by round 2, the crowd knew something was wrong. Nick landed a clean punch, then another, then a flurry. Frank dropped to the canvas. The ref jumped in. It was over. Frank later admitted he had a broken arm going into the fight, but the damage was already done, not just to his body, but to his brand. The CBS debut, the redemption arc, the grand return. It collapsed on national television. Promoters saw it as a liability. Networks called him too old, too polarizing, and sponsors? They vanished overnight. He tried to shift lanes. He launched documentary series, started writing books, and pitched MMA reality shows. Some got interest. Most didn't get past the first meeting. Industry executives called him difficult. They didn't want a veteran with opinions. They wanted silence. Frank wasn't willing to pretend, and the media world wasn't willing to bend. Even in the emerging YouTube fight analysis space, Frank remained mostly absent. His insights were too sharp, too detailed, too real. He didn't play the hot take game. He dissected the fight like a philosopher. And in an era of 5-second clips and viral trash talk, that didn't sell. The CBS fight should have been a new chapter. Instead, it became the last major moment of his fighting career. He had trained for decades, bled, sacrificed, changed the game. But in one night, on one network, he was seen as done. And what followed wasn't just decline, it was silence. The kind that slowly rewrites your name out of history. Frank's story took an even darker turn in 2019, one that had nothing to do with punches or promotions. At Dallas Love Field Airport, a truck was found abandoned. Inside it were 2 dogs, reportedly tied up, left in the vehicle for several days. It didn't take long before someone traced the vehicle back to one name, Frank Shamrock. The headlines exploded. MMA legend leaves dogs tied in truck. Frank Shamrock under investigation for animal neglect. TMZ, ESPN, and every major news site ran the story. And for a man already living on the outskirts of the fight world, this was devastating. Frank quickly responded. He said he was in the process of moving his mother and couldn't find a proper shelter to take the dogs. He claimed he left food and water, that it was a mistake, but not one of cruelty. Still, the damage was done. Animal rights groups demanded punishment. Former fans turned on him. UFC personalities stayed silent. No formal charges were filed, but public opinion doesn't wait for court rulings. In the court of social media, Frank was already guilty. Memes circulated. Reddit threads roasted him. MMA outlets used the story as a punchline. Another reason, they said, that Frank wasn't Hall of Fame material. For Frank, it was a personal humiliation. He had spent years teaching about self-discipline, responsibility, and the spiritual side of fighting. Now, one careless act overshadowed decades of contribution. He wasn't the first modern MMA fighter anymore. He was that guy who abandoned his dogs. In interviews afterward, Frank seemed numb. He acknowledged the backlash. He apologized, but the pain lingered. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who made a mistake during a chaotic period in his life. But in a sport that forgets its heroes fast, mistakes tend to stick longer than legacy. And just like that, the final nail seemed driven into the coffin of his public career. The UFC still wouldn't mention him. Media outlets used him only when controversy hit. And fans? They only brought him up in comment sections, rarely with kindness. Frank Shamrock's rise had been driven by innovation, his fall by silence, fracture, and one very public failure. But what hurt most wasn't the fight world turning away. It was that no one even seemed to notice he was gone. Watch any major UFC event today, and you'll hear broadcasters rave about complete fighter. They'll praise champions champions for blending wrestling, striking, and submissions. They'll point to Georges St-Pierre's balance, Jon Jones's unpredictability, Islam Makhachev's control. But almost never do they mention the man who pioneered that philosophy, Frank Shamrock. Frank didn't just evolve the sport, he built the system modern fighters use. He was the first to say, "You need to be good everywhere." Before it was cool to train across disciplines, Frank was doing it. Before cardio management was considered a science, he was tracking his breath patterns. He studied how to win by planning 10 steps ahead. Yet the UFC treats him like a ghost in the machine. His absence isn't accidental, it's institutional. When the UFC rolls out its highlight reels, his victories are edited out. When they release documentaries on MMA's growth, his name is a footnote, if it appears at all. New fans entering the sport might recognize Ken Shamrock due to early UFC marketing, but Frank, they wouldn't know he existed. And what's worse, the fighters who dominate today, they do what Frank did. They use his blueprint. His style is the language modern MMA speaks in. Fighters like Demetrius Johnson, Dominic Cruz, and Max Holloway all utilize footwork, timing, and diverse attacks in ways that mirror Frank's philosophy. But none were trained by him, and few acknowledge him. Even on forums, when lists of GOATs or pioneers appear, Frank's name barely cracks the top 10. Not because he didn't earn it, but because he was surgically erased from the UFC narrative. His voice, once so loud and confident, is now barely a whisper in MMA history. He tried to reclaim his legacy by doing analyst work, training seminars, and YouTube commentary, but the numbers didn't follow. Fans didn't click. The younger generation was too deep into the UFC ecosystem to realize they were watching echoes of a man they'd never heard of. Imagine creating the blueprint for a billion-dollar empire, only to watch them build it without ever acknowledging your name on the first page. That's Frank Shamrock's legacy, everywhere, yet invisible, praised in technique, ignored in name. And as MMA history keeps marching forward, it leaves behind the man who saw the future before anyone else knew it was coming. Most fighters, no matter how rocky their past, eventually get their redemption moment. Even those who had ugly feuds with Dana White, Tito Ortiz, Josh Barnett, even Randy Couture managed to make peace, or at least be acknowledged. But Frank Shamrock remains a glaring omission. No Hall of Fame ceremony, no public olive branch, just silence. Behind the scenes, insiders say it's personal. Frank didn't just criticize the UFC, he challenged it. He called out fighter pay before it was trending. He slammed the company for failing to offer medical benefits. He suggested organizing fighters into a collective. He publicly accused Dana White of blackballing him and claimed the UFC was rewriting history to glorify company men and erase dissidents. And he didn't just make those accusations once, he repeated them again and again across podcasts, interviews, and even during broadcast appearances on rival promotion. He was the guy who wouldn't play nice. He didn't want to be brought back into the fold under a gag order. He wanted honesty. He wanted fighters protected, and that made him a permanent problem. There's another layer too. Dana White values control. Fighters who step out of line tend to get edited out. Those who fall in line, even after chaos, are forgiven. But Frank never fell in line. He refused to take the knee. Even when the money dried up, even when the fans faded, he didn't apologize for being right too early. He also made another bold move that sealed the divide. He sued the UFC over intellectual property rights in the mid-2000s and teen, accusing them of using his likeness without consent in promotional material and old fight footage. It wasn't just a cash grab, it was a defiant middle finger to a company he believed had wronged him. The UFC responded with the quietest punishment possible. They made him vanish. No promotion, no mention, no legacy nod, just a cold shoulder that's lasted more than 2 decades. Other fighters with shorter resumes and fewer contributions are immortalized on stage at Hall of Fame events. Frank, he's not even in the audience. And the fans? Some remember, some demand justice, but most are too new to the sport to know what they lost. The UFC is a memory machine, and Frank Shamrock is a name it deliberately forgot. What's left is a man outside the castle he helped design, not looking for a trophy, but looking for the dignity of recognition. And in the UFC, sometimes dignity is the rarest prize of all. Today, Frank Shamrock is 52. He lives far from the lights, far from the octagon. There are no crowds chanting his name, no walkouts, no camera crews. The man who once stood as the smartest, most advanced fighter in the world now walks alone, physically healthy, but spiritually exhausted. He's spoken about the pain of being erased, not just from a company, but from history. "I gave the sport everything," he once said, "and when it grew, it spit me out." He never made UFC money, never got the multi-million-dollar fight contracts. When Conor McGregor was cashing $30 million checks, Frank was hosting small seminars to pay his bill. And while other fighters secured brand deals, podcast empires, or coaching gigs, Frank struggled to find footing. His attempt to transition to media fizzled. He was too honest, too raw. He didn't offer sound bites. He offered hard truths. And hard truths don't trend. He briefly ran a podcast, hoping to build an audience around deeper conversations, spiritual lessons, and fighter wellness. But the numbers didn't stick. The sponsors didn't come. He stopped uploading. He's opened up about the long-term psychological weight he carries, not just from being excluded, but from watching people he mentored find success while he was ignored. "They took the playbook," he said in a rare 2023 interview, but never said who wrote it. Frank's personal life has also suffered. The loss of his adoptive father, Bob Shamrock, shattered him. His feud with Ken left a hole that never healed. His attempts at reconciliation never gained traction. He's admitted he doesn't attend UFC events because it hurts too much. He feels like a stranger in the sport he once defined. The final blow was the realization that legacy isn't always about impact. It's about who controls the narrative. Frank built something revolutionary, but because he wasn't politically convenient, it was buried. Now, he spends his days mentoring in small gyms, speaking to at-risk youth, and practicing mindfulness. Not because he's given up, but because he's accepted something painful. The world might never give him the credit he deserves. Frank Shamrock built the foundation. Others built the tower. And now, he walks past it quietly, uninvited. The blueprint still bears his fingerprints, but the signature was erased. And that, more than any knockout, any rivalry, any scandal, is the real tragedy of Frank Shamrock.